I'm Anna Rose. I'm the Exhibitions and Programming Associate at the Wende. This is Cold War Spaces number 10 already. Today's guest is Robeson Taj Frazier, who will be interviewed by Joes Segal, the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. Robeson is an Associate Professor of Communications at USC and Director of the Institute for Diversity Empowerment at Annenberg. He's worked with the Wende on a number of projects and was the consulting curator for our 29 exhibition, Non-Alignment in Tito in Africa. He's the author of The East is Black, Cold War China, and the Black Radical Imagination. His more recent work explores multimedia art and African-American community formation in LA. The latter is our topic today, community space. This is gonna be a 30-minute talk, and after that, we'll open it up to questions from the audience, so please get ready to type your questions in the Q&A box. We apologize in advance if we can't get to your question during the 15 minutes allotted for the Q&A. We'll post the recording of this talk to our Vimeo page afterwards if you'd like to share it with your friends or go back and watch our past programs. I'd also like to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting our discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. Right, Joes, let's get started.
Okay, thank you, Anna Rose. And so in our Cold War Spaces series, so far we have been focusing on the socialist countries, especially East Germany, Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, and China. But today we're going to talk about the United States, and specifically African-American community formation in response to experiences at home and abroad. We will speak about racism in the context of the Cold War and the impact of the Vietnam War, and we will zoom in on filmmaker and arts educator Ben Caldwell in the Leimert Park neighborhood in Los Angeles, discussing how the outpour of local cultural creativity is connected to formative Cold War experiences. We will also touch upon the Black Lives Matter movement and its significance for community formation right now. It's a great pleasure to have Taj Frazier, as Anna Rose already mentioned, who has worked on several projects with the Wende Museum, as our guest today. So Taj, welcome to Cold War Spaces.
Thank you so much again for having me. Very, very delighted to be in communication with you. And thank you everyone who is listening in and watching. I really appreciate you taking some time out of your day to be with us.
Perfect. So yeah, let me start with some historical background. In the ideological struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States, structural racism in American society has been a recurrent point of Soviet criticism and Soviet propaganda. And how far would you say has the African-American community picked up on this criticism?
Right. Good question to begin. So yeah, Soviet criticism of the US and especially structural racism in the US, if we think about it from the 1920s on, the Soviets, like many other countries and still to this day, pointed out the kind of glaring wound of kind of and contradiction of US claims of democracy, freedom, and justice for all. And that, ongoing kind of glaring wound and contradiction is that of the treatment of Black people, brown people, the poor, indigenous populations in the United States. So the Soviets, pointed that out, and they weren't the first, goodness, even before the establishment of the United States, that critique was being made, and especially thereafter. We can just go back to the late 18th century or the early 19th century and think about the Haitian Revolution, and them pointing out the contradictions of U.S. and French, claims of fraternité and liberté, goodness, 200 years ago. We can think about the mid-19th century and the Mexican government doing the same during the U.S.'s war with Mexico, where the United States basically seized land, the states that we now know of as Texas and New Mexico and California, right? That critique was being made. And then towards the end of the 19th century, in the Philippines, during the U.S.'s war with Spain. So there's been an ongoing critique of, outside of the U.S. of structural racism, of racial capitalism. But I think it's also important to highlight that this critique by foreign governments, foreign movements, in many ways has been shaped and informed by the insights of the people directly impacted by structural racism, who have lived it, experienced it, felt it, you know, on a ubiquitous quotidian basis, and that is Black, brown, indigenous people. You know, in many ways, the Soviet policy, even in the 1920s, was being informed and shaped by the ideas of Black people throughout the diaspora. I mean, Claude McKay, a Jamaican writer and activist, played a pivotal role in shaping some of the Soviets' early policies. Various other Black radicals during that period also. So I think it's really important to highlight that really at the forefront of the critique of, you know, structural racism in the U.S. and U.S. participation in Euro-American empire, you know, have been Black and brown people and indigenous people.
Right. And how did, in turn, this threat in Soviet criticism resonate with the African-American community? I mean, you just explained they were at the basis of it.
Yeah.
I think it was probably a two-way discussion, right?
Very much so. I think, you know, from my engagement with histories of Black solidarity movements and international solidarity movements, especially with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union during the 1920s through the 1970s, you know, represented for many Black people throughout the diaspora another kind of alternative model of socio-political development, of how to organize society, and it represented an alternative kind of model than that of liberal democracy. And the Soviets, you know, put resources behind the talk as well. I mean, they helped support the publication of pamphlets. They helped support, you know, the organization of political movements in the U.S. and various other places. I mean, we, you know, just referencing different examples from history, you know, the Scottsboro Boys, a group of young Black men who were falsely accused of, you know, a variety of crimes, but especially assault. You know, the Soviets helped put lots of resources behind generating global awareness about this you know, kind of this atrocity. So I mean, in many ways, it's definitely been you know, communication across borders, and there were various, you know, Black radicals who also traveled to the Soviet Union and were extremely impressed with the developments they saw taking shape there, you know, throughout the 1920s through 1970s. I mean, Langston Hughes, Paul Robeson, W.B. Du Bois, Shirley Graham Du Bois.
No, for sure, yeah. So in your book, which Anne and Rose already mentioned, The East is Black, Cold War China and the Black Radical Imagination, you describe how since the late 1950s, some African-American intellectuals shifted their attention from the Soviet Union or the Soviet bloc countries to Maoist China as a source of inspiration. Can you tell us what brought about that change? And also maybe what did these intellectuals actually know about Mao and his policies?
Sure. So the shift or the rise of communist China as an alternative kind of imaginary for radical change and an alternative kind of model of international relations, national economic development, that really was a product of several developments. Kind of China's increasing appeal among Black American activists and intellectuals. So part of it was prompted by the conclusion of World War II and increasing awareness, you know, among Black Americans that participation in defeating, you know, a genocidal Nazi government abroad, you know, did not change their treatment and experience back home in the United States, right? So GIs returning home and being lynched, the realities that many of the kind of benefits of post-World War II would not be shared by Black Americans, many of the kind of economic benefits, opportunities for kind of upward economic mobility would not be experienced, you know. So this was one part of it, right? And this was actually this was made even more clear during the Korean War and the Vietnam War, when Black American troops and soldiers, you know, found themselves being forced to kind of reconcile the reality that they were being shipped to kill, you know, people of color on the other side of the world, while people of color were being killed back home, right? They were being shipped to enforce, U.S. military intervention abroad, and basically being positioned to help the U.S. extend its project of empire building. So having to reconcile all of that, was part of what led to this kind of, looking to China. It was also prompted by the decline among some leftist movements of the Soviet Union as the kind of face or leader of a global anti-colonial revolution. And lastly, it was prompted by the rise of newly independent African, Asian, Latin American governments and national liberation movements, especially from 1947 on. So with all of this happening, it was within this context that China emerged as a potential ally and advocate for liberation movements throughout the world. And one of the things that made China especially appealing was, first off, that this was a government that explicitly prioritized the participation of some of the most downtrodden populations within China, some of the most economically, politically repressed and disenfranchised populations, rural peasants, as being, agents within creating a protracted struggle of, societal transformation. So that was one of the things that, Black Americans found especially appealing. What was also appealing about the Chinese was the fact that within their rhetoric, they were explicit about centering their critique of Euro-American power, centering that critique within both a critique of capitalism, a critique of imperialism, but also a critique of racism, right? They did not see racism as simply just a symptom of class or as something that was only specific to the US, but part of a global system of power and inequity. So I think those were several factors that were helping to shape this increasing appeal of China among various Black radical thinkers, movements during the 1950s, 1960s, early 1970s.
Okay, thank you, very clear. And you mentioned the Vietnam War. Of course, as we all know, African Americans were overrepresented during that war in combat tasks and dangerous operations. And of course, Spike Lee's recent movie, The Five Bloods, addresses some of these experiences. So what would you say was the general feeling about risking their lives to fight the communist Vietnamese? And also, what was the impact of Martin Luther King's speech, Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence in 1967?
I'm very happy that you mentioned that speech. I think when Martin Luther King's name is referenced within kind of U.S. popular and political cultures, his impact, the power of his thought in many ways has been whitewashed within dominant kind of within the U.S. kind of status quo representation of him. It's a very, very, very simple representation as opposed to focusing on the complexity of his work and as well as how his thought and practice evolved over the course of his lifetime. And the speech that you reference, where he condemns the Vietnam War, where he centers the Black freedom struggle as tied to global movements throughout the world, in opposition to U.S. military occupation, in opposition to efforts to reinstitute new forms of colonialism throughout the world. That's a very important speech that more of us should be reading, especially in the moment in which we're living right now. So Black positions about the Vietnam War, especially among troops, were, from my assessment of history, from my conversations with my parents, my elders, from folks who were directly, involved in the war, whether it be as activists in opposition to it or soldiers who were, troops on the ground, their perspectives about the war during its time were, all across the board. You had various folks who were drafted into the war who did not support it, but who were compelled in many ways to participate in it or face, incarceration. You had others who in the aftermath returned to the US and were avid participants in the movements in opposition to the war. So I think it's important to just highlight that there was no monolithic perspective among Black activists, Black troops about the war. And I think that's actually, I'm not going to spoil the film for folks, but I think that's an important piece that people will see among the characters in the war, that their political perspectives, their ideologies are not uniform or singular,
yeah,
right?
Right.
So I think it's important to highlight that. But one thing actually I'll showcase. So two of the people who I write about in my book, hold on one second, I'll pull this up for you. And so two of the people who I write about in my book, Robert and Mabel Williams. Let's see, let me see this here. So Robert and Mabel Williams, who you'll see at the bottom of the screen, these were two activists, intellectuals from Monroe, North Carolina, who were forced to flee the United States as a result of their political activism against racial injustice, who were forced to flee first to Cuba and then later to China. They were provided exile in China, and they cultivated and ran a really phenomenal, what they called propaganda machine, where they used radio, film, and the press to connect Black Americans to political movements, political changes in various parts of the world. One of the publications that they produced while in China was called Listen Brother, which you'll see to the right of your screen. This was a publication which was authored to and for Black troops stationed in Vietnam, Black American troops stationed in Vietnam. And within the publication, Robert and Mabel Williams use, the written word as well as photographs and various kind of poetic aesthetics to encourage Black troops to liken their struggles against racial injustice, racial violence in the US to that of the violence being experienced and exhibited against the Vietnamese, right? Mm-hmm. Part of what they were encouraging Black troops to do was to not see their struggles in the US as disconnected from the struggles of the Vietnamese, but to see them as being interlocked, to the point where these pamphlets were airdropped onto battlefields and bases where US troops were stationed and fighting. And several troops returned to the US referencing the pamphlet as one of numerous examples that helped further politicize and radicalize their outlook in opposition to the US government's actions, both at home and abroad. So this is just one example that speaks to the various ways that Black troops, even on the ground, were engaged with rethinking their participation in the war, right? And as well as in terms of being more engaged with the history of the Vietnamese people's struggles against, French occupation, French colonialism, and then that of the US government. So just one example to highlight how different forms of media serve to broaden and expand Black American troops' perspectives about the war and their participation in it.
Right. So actually, one of the Vietnamese, or one of the soldiers in Vietnam, I want to highlight now, Ben Caldwell. You're working with him on a new project, and Rose mentioned it already, and it's to do with African American community formation in Leimert Park. Can you tell us a little bit about this project, and maybe also how Ben Caldwell's experience in Vietnam was instrumental or was a motivating factor in starting his activities in Leimert Park?
Sure. So actually, I'm going to share, just so since we're talking about Ben, and I'm sure hopefully people here are aware of who Ben is and the work that he's been doing, but for those who haven't, I think it's important, since he's not with us, I just want to share some images of Ben in the space that he's been running for the last 35 plus years, Chaos Network. Hold on. Here we go. Share this again. Sorry about that. So Ben, Ben is a filmmaker. He's a filmmaker. He's an artist. Is this sharing? Sorry about that. Already.
Yeah, it's clear enough. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah.
So Ben is a filmmaker, a photographer, a multimedia artist who has been, sorry, this keeps going forward, who has been, doing extremely important work in the Leimert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, which is, Leimert Park is a neighborhood in South Central Los Angeles, kind of the northern part of South Central Los Angeles. Ben, many folks have been introduced to Ben's work as an artist first, as a filmmaker when he was part of a collective of filmmakers known as the LA Rebellion cinematic movement, which is a movement of filmmakers who connected as film students at UCLA and who made films from the late 1960s, I mean, still to this day, films which were informed by a variety of radical cinematic traditions, but also informed by Black expressive culture, especially the kind of aesthetics of blues music, jazz, assemblage, quilt making, and whose works in many ways challenge many of the conventions of film, both in terms of storytelling, both in terms of process of making the film, both in terms of how they work to center Black subjectivity, Black diasporic subjectivity, and the complexities of that in their work. And what's interesting too is how the legacy of the work. The work, in many ways, you can see it in, I mean, the legacy of the work, if you look at the work of, filmmakers like Arthur Jaffa or Jenin Kuru or Khalil Joseph, or the videos of Beyonce and Solange, videos like Lemonade, you can see the legacy of this collective's, the LA Rebellion Collective's impact. Ben is the founder as well of Chaos Network. This is a community-driven arts and multimedia lab and creative space in Leimert Park. And yeah, I've been pretty fortunate over the last 3 years to work with him on several projects, which include a book project that's centered around his work and that of others who have contributed to radical Black avant-garde artistic and media cultures in Los Angeles. And then as well, a community-led and produced archive that's centered around histories of performance, media, art, and community fellowship in South Central Los Angeles. So we've been able to work on these two projects over the last couple of years. To your question about Ben's experience in the Vietnam War. So Ben is originally he's from Deming, New Mexico. As a 21-year-old art student in Arizona, he was drafted into the war. And when he talks about it, he doesn't say he was drafted. He said he was captured. He describes, being drafted as being captured, being in many ways kind of incarcerated for 2.5 years. One of the things that's particularly important, though, is, and that he highlights, is that the war taught him very important lessons. Number one, it made obvious to him the ways that media, in particular film and news media, play in reinforcing dominant ideas about U.S. democracy and freedom, and the various ways that film and news media serve as a kind of, as forms of propaganda in negating, denying the terror that has been part of the American project, right? The terror that has been a part of the American project. And as well, he became more critical of the ways that film, news media, and art more broadly have served to reproduce demeaning representations, images, and ideologies about people of color. So one of the things he determined soon after arriving in Vietnam was that he was going to use his camera as a weapon of pushing back against all of that, right? And so throughout his time in Vietnam, he used his camera to document the realities and contradictions of the war, the mundaneness of being a soldier, the beauty and uniqueness and complexities of Vietnam and its people, beauty, uniqueness, complexities of the troops that he was experiencing this all with. And he was fortunate, you know, to survive. And once back in the US, he came back with a serious investment in centering his artistic practice as a tool and resource for fellowship and healing. I think that's one of the things that's phenomenal about Ben and his creative practice, as well as the kind of creative practice of Chaos Network, and even more broadly, the Lemert Village. That the work that they do on a daily basis, whether it be through the arts, whether it be through the practices of the business owners, whether it be through the educational activities that they do, it's very much organized around healing and spiritual cosmic fellowship. So that, I guess, speaks to some degree to some of the work that he does, that he's been doing.
Right. So, Taj, while I ask the next question, maybe we can return to speaker's view.
Oh, yeah.
I know there's a lot more to say about Chaos Network, but we are already approaching the half-hour mark. So I'm sure some of these questions will come up in Q&A, but I would like to finally bring up the current situation with the Black Lives Matters movement and how you see this development. If you predict a structural change right now, what are your hopes? What are your expectations of what is going on right now?
Goodness, that's a big question.
I know.
So I've learned from my little bit of time on the planet. I won't make any predictions. What I will say is that these are obviously extremely, extremely troubling, challenging, unprecedented kinds of times that we're living within. One of the things I've been inspired by, you know, amid the pandemic, has been the increasing movements of, you know, intergenerational collectives, multi-ethnic collectives of people in the streets. I've been moved by seeing queer and Black women who've been doing this work, and queer women of color who've been doing this work for a long time, at the forefront, and people being explicit about centering their criticisms of police violence, the disproportionate ways that the pandemic has been impacting Black and brown, working poor, and poor communities, seeing people connect that criticism, that critique, to an explicit critique of patriarchy, an explicit critique of the violence committed against trans people, an explicit critique against the various ways that what's happening in the US connects to political struggles, political movements throughout the world. So that I found to be extremely, extremely inspiring. I've also been inspired to see the ways that in Los Angeles specifically, and connecting this back to Lemert Park, the ways that various business owners, artists, activists have been working collectively to number one, encourage people, number one, to be more critical about where we spend our dollars, all right, to support Black and brown business owners, to recognize the relationship between how resources are allocated at a city level and state level ties into, you know, broader structures of racial and economic inequity, and who have been using art and culture as key modes of energizing, mobilizing the people. It's been a reminder, you know, of the power of culture, that it's culture which allows us, encourages us to imagine something else, and which serves as a key mode of bringing us together to collectively do the work of enacting that, even if it's, you know, in that space, that in order for us to create the kind of worlds that we want to see exist, you know, within our cities, we have to be able to do that within our communities. We have to be able to experience that, even if it's short-lived, even if it's ephemeral. So yeah, there have been a number of organizations in LA who I just want to shout out, you know, organizations like Crenshaw Dairy Mart, Trap Heels, the Movement for Black Lives Matter, California African American Museum, the Underground Museum. All these organizations have been doing the work before the pandemic, where art, culture, have served as key sites for us to imagine new possibilities. And we see people enacting that. So that I found to be extremely inspiring. Great,
thank you. So let's move to the Q&A. There are already a few questions, and everyone feel free to type your questions under the Q&A box. Bruce Hollian, when I look at countries connected with the USSR and the People's Republic of China, I feel that I can realistically look to Cuba for multiracial development of society. Although I feel that the USSR argument that American power is strengthened by their confusion of the class struggle with the race struggle and how it affects American people of color, I have to think about how the USSR dealt with its minorities is not exactly something which is ideal. I'm talking about the NKVD's forced resettling of the Crimean Tatars under Stalin. I feel that Putin's Russia of today is not one to tell others how to live. Take a look at some of their laws, in particular bill number 26265.7. I'm not sure everyone knows what it is, on amendments to Article 116 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation. I also look askance at China's treatment of Uyghur minorities, which is in the news today. Additionally, I can't ignore Nigeria's condemnation of Chinese treatment of Nigerians today. So as much as I'd like to welcome outside help with regard to improving racial issues in the USA, I now believe that we Americans need to continue working on these pressing matters. Thanks for mentioning Leimert Park. When I was in my late teens, I would often visit the Inner City Cultural Center to discover the music of the LA contingent of the Ornette Coleman scene. Bobby Bradford and John Carter come to mind. Thank you very much indeed, Robeson Taj Frazier, for illuminating crucial issues today. That was a very long comment.
Yeah, but very insightful. I mean, Mr. Holland, thank you for your comment. And I'm in agreement with you that while the Soviets, positioned themselves as an ally and utilized, I mean, and in many ways, they and the Chinese too. I mean, and somebody I think brings this up in another question. Part of their criticisms of U.S. Structural racism and economic inequity was tied to their investment. Yes, somebody points this out, in destabilizing the U.S. government as a model and leader of international relations. The Soviets were, in many ways, working to position themselves as an alternative model, ally, and leader of what geopolitical relations could look like and be, especially, after World War II. So, no, I think extremely important to highlight that while in many ways they positioned and worked to connect with particular African-American movements and intellectuals, part of that was tied to, number one, repositioning themselves in terms of world affairs. And this constantly, and part of this also, was and part of what they did not speak to were the various ways that, racism and as well as power dynamics were shaping the domestic context in their own countries. And I think the critique of the Chinese is right on as well. While the Chinese were highlighting via propaganda and statements their support for Black American movements in the U.S. and elsewhere, while they were highlighting and positioning themselves in terms of support of national liberation movements in Africa, African students throughout China were constantly surveilled, experienced, extreme racial repression and mistreatment. So I think these are extremely important to highlight. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Another question is from Erica Camisa Morale. It's a little bit related. Could you expand on the variety of views of the USSR that existed within the African-American movement? And could you also tell us more about cultural exchanges between the African-American community in the Soviet
Sure. So
Union?
I will speak a little, just so we have, in the interest of time, I'll speak more to the second part of the question. Right. Thank you too for the question. So the variety of cultural exchanges, and there are a number of historians who've written extensively about this. So some of these cultural exchanges, where Paul Robeson, for instance, traveled back and forth to the Soviet Union before having his passport seized, where, he spent time having serious conversations and exchanges with Russian intellectuals, learning, goodness, various, Russian folk songs. I mean, that was part of Paul Robeson's arsenal. He really centered music as a mode of connecting movements of workers and oppressed populations throughout the world. And one book I'll just highlight that speaks a bit to this, but also just highlights the legacy of Paul Robeson's work is that of Shauna Redman has a book out called Everyday Man, which looks at the legacy of Paul Robeson and the impact of Paul Robeson. Another person who I'll mention too is Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes spent time traveling in various parts Soviet Union. I mean, a number of Black activists, and I wouldn't say that, I mean, many of them, might have romanticized some of what they imagined in the Soviet Union, and then traveled there to reconcile that imaginary of the Soviet Union with the kind of everyday realities. And they documented that in their writings, in their work. So I think it's also important to revisit some of that work, because what you'll find is how their thinking in relationship to the Soviet Union and China and various other places developed over time. Even to the point about Cuba being a multiracial society, that was one of the interesting things I found among numerous Black activists who traveled to Cuba. They found Cuba to be extremely impressive in a variety of ways, but what they also found was that the populations who still weren't experiencing the benefits of Cuba's shift to being a socialist communist country were Black Cubans. And they learned, how various kind of religions and practices, African-based religions and practices were demonized by the Cuban government. And this kind of clashed with their imaginary of what, Cuba represented within global solidarity movements. And they had to reconcile that after traveling there and building real relationships with Black Cubans.
So if I may follow up on that, in the early 1970s, Angela Davis traveled through the Soviet Union, East Germany, and Cuba. What were her experiences, and how did she see the relation between political reality and what she expected to find?
Can you repeat that? Sorry, again. You said, say that again?
Yeah, I wanted to bring up Angela Davis's experience during her 1970s travel to the Soviet Union, East Germany, and Cuba, and her experiences. Yeah.
I think, I think, this is I mean, she obviously, and she's still here, she can better answer that question than I ever could. I think, Angela Davis represents another, pivotal intellectual an activist intellectual who is shaped and is shaping, generations of activists and people's perceptions about the world and structures of racial, economic inequity, injustice. And so I think, like many others, her experiences abroad offered her new opportunities to build relationships and ties across political movements. I think that's probably the most important point, that being able to, number one, being able to travel, especially, after experiencing or being able to travel. I mean, first off, being able to live abroad and study abroad, offered her new lens on the country in which she grew up in, right? So she returns to the U.S. with a more expansive view about U.S. Inequality, U.S. Structural violence, and understands that as tied to structural violence throughout the world. Right.
I have a question here from Danny Birchall, who happens to be the co-curator of our War of Nerves exhibition about the psychological aspects of the Cold War. He writes, I'd like to thank Professor Frazier for a fascinating talk. I was particularly taken with the point you made early in the talk about how anti-racist activism developed within the US informed critiques of US racism developed within the USSR. In a post-Cold War world, Do you see that interaction between domestic and international anti-racism happening anywhere today?
Oh, thank you for that question. Yes, very much so. I think if we just look at the movements of solidarity and that have been in the streets in places like, you know, London, in France, you know, during the pandemic, you know, that critiquing, you know, number one, the murder of George Floyd, the murder of Breonna Taylor, the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, the murder of so many people in the US. You know, we've seen global expressions of solidarity, but as well as the ways that within these same contexts, they've connected that to police violence in London, police violence in the UK, the disproportionate way that Black and brown populations are being impacted by, not simply by the pandemic, but have been positioned, you know, in ways where the pandemic impacts them in far more devastating ways than other populations who might live just miles away from them. So I think we're seeing, you know, right now we're seeing these kinds of connections, and these aren't new, you know, these aren't new. I can just highlight, for instance, you know, many people now are chanting, you know, in the U.S., Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives. You know, Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives, they've been building international relationships and points of solidarity since their establishment. I mean, just one organization I'll mention is the Freedom Dreamers, you know, who alongside it was a collective of activists of color from throughout the U.S., from St. Louis, from Ferguson, from Florida, from California, from, you know, LA, Oakland, who traveled to Palestine as a collective and built and used that as an opportunity to learn about the realities of the Palestinians, to learn about the occupation, and you know, these kinds of, you know, experience points of connections have continued thereafter, where we see, you know, expressions of support for the struggles being waged on the streets here, but also the struggles being waged on the streets in Palestine. So I do think, you know, it's, you know, these kind of anti-racist points of solidarity. I mean, this has been part of political struggles being waged, as I mentioned, all the way back. I mean, goodness, even all the way back to Toussaint Louverture.
Okay, thank you. I have another question here. How many remember a Californian congresswoman named Helen Douglas, who spent 8 days in the mid-40s naming every Black serviceman from World War II? She got them in the congressional record, at least. I don't know. Are you familiar with this story?
I'm not, and I make sure I look it up because I'm not aware of the story. But I think this point that the attendee makes about them being screwed by the GI Bill is extremely important.
Right.
The GI Bill, which, you know, produces opportunities for education, you know, getting loans, you know, low interest loans to buy homes. You know, Black GIs in many ways were excluded from these benefits after the war. You know, these were benefits that have produced intergenerational wealth. So when we talk about, you know, the depths of structural racism, this is an extremely important point. I mean, Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about this in The Case for Reparations, that article, which, you know, he wrote several years ago, which I see circulating still to this day, which highlights the various ways that, you know, predatory lending practices, as well as the exclusion of Black people from policies such as kind of GI Bill, has produced, you know, cycles of, you know, intergenerational poverty, you know, and lack of access to, you know, producing intergenerational wealth. So that's a really important point. Great.
Taj, I want to thank you so much for this wonderful interview, and very enlightening as well. It was a great pleasure to have you.
As always, thank you as always. And, you know, I'm sorry we didn't get to share as much more about Leimert Park, but I would definitely recommend people spend some time there if you're fortunate to be in Los Angeles. If you live in Los Angeles, you know, definitely spend some time there, support the businesses and community spaces that are there. It's a really dynamic, vibrant community.
Right, and please keep us posted on your project with Ben as well.
Very much so. Thanks again.
Sure. Our next interview next week is with Troy Chatterjee, Professor of History at California State University, LA. under the title Gender Space, Who Should a Woman Speak For in a Post-World Order? I hope to see you there. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.